Good afternoon. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to the William G. McGowan Theater here at the National Archives. And a special welcome to those of you who are joining us on YouTube. Today we're pleased to have Robert O'Hara Jr. with us to talk about his new book, The Quartermaster, Montgomery C. Meigs, Lincoln's General, Master Builder of the Union Army. General Meigs' name may not be as familiar as Grant or Sherman, but he was instrumental to the victories won by those generals. But before we dig into the full history of the Master Builder of the Union Army, I'd like to tell you about two programs that we'll be hosting next month. On Thursday, November 3rd at 7, Adam Rothman, Professor of History at Georgetown, will discuss the university's roots in the slave economy of America and their implications for today. This program is presented in partnership with the Historical Society of Washington, D.C. as the Letitia Woods Brown Memorial Lecture to open the 43rd Annual Conference on D.C. History. And on Wednesday, November 9th at noon, in commemoration of Veterans Day and the 75th anniversary of the Tuskegee Airmen, we'll show the film The Luft Gangster, Memoirs of a Second-Class Hero, which tells the story of Tuskegee Airman Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Jefferson. The film's director, Mike Rott, will introduce the film and answer audience questions. To learn more about these and all of our programs, consult our monthly calendar of events in print or online. There are sign-up sheets in the lobby where you can receive it regularly. And another way to get more involved in the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports all of our education and outreach activities, and there are applications also in the lobby. Montgomery Meigs' documentary legacy is powerfully represented in several record groups here at the National Archives. Fortunately for us, we do not have to personally follow the winding paper trail to learn about his life. We have Robert O'Hara's new biography to bring the details together in one place. To give us a flavor of the archival connections to the general and to introduce today's speaker, I'd like to bring to the stage Trevor Plant. Trevor is chief of the Reference Services branch here in this building. Trevor is my go-to guy for records in the agency. I rely on him to woo VIP guests at our flagship building. I refer to him as O.A. Otis, as he is currently the other archivist of the United States. He is other until he really makes me upset, and I ship him off to some distant, secluded archives outpost. My only regret is that Alaska is no longer an option as the best place to send him when he fails to produce on an urgent matter I have tasked him with. I'm currently working on getting an archives facility in Antarctica so that one day there will be one FTE stationed there. This will happen once we get a real budget from Congress. You know, something that lets me spend beyond mid-December. His chief accomplishment at this agency was serving as the cook who brought home the bacon for the United States in the Bacon War cook-off between the United States and Canada, ensuring the U.S. reigned supreme. He also found records instrumental in helping describe to Canadians in great detail how we diverted a full-on war from the pig war between the United States and Britain. Speaking of war with Canada, he supplied me with a great piece of documentation that I love to describe to Canadian archivists and hockey players alike as our secret plan to invade Canada during the interwar years. In the spirit of full disclosure, Trevor wrote his own introduction. Please welcome Trevor Plant.
That's what happens when you send a joke bio to one of your friends who works in the archivist's office. Thank you, David, for that surprising introduction, since there was another one I thought he was going to read. Good afternoon, everyone. A few blocks away stands a massive brick building, now the National Building Museum. It was once the pension building, designed and built by Montgomery Meigs in the 1880s to house the ballooning staff of the Pension Bureau as they processed hundreds of thousands, which would become millions of post-Civil War pension applications. Those applications from veterans and next of kin, whether approved or denied, are in this building and are among some of our most frequently consulted records. A short trip across the Potomac River stands Arlington National Cemetery. Montgomery Meigs was instrumental in developing the National Cemetery System. It was to his office that fell the task of identifying, recovering, and reinterring the remains of the Union's fallen soldiers and sailors. Those records are also found in this building and are increasingly being used by historians wishing to learn more about how our country commemorates our veterans. Genealogists are also relying on Quartermaster records, consulting headstone applications and burial records, hoping to find the final resting place of their ancestors. Meg's own wartime service is also documented here, not just in the usual military service records, but also in the voluminous records created by the Union Quartermaster's office while Meigs was Quartermaster General. This biography of Meigs fills in the story of a man who was instrumental to the success of the Union Army. Renowned Civil War historian James McPherson praised the work, saying, "This splendid biography offers new insights on this man of many talents." If you get the book and read the back book jacket, Professor McPherson goes on to say even more kind words about not only Meigs, but the biography itself. Jeffrey Wirt, author of The Sword of Lincoln, The Army of the Potomac, called The Quartermaster a compelling biography that is rich in details and rightly places Meigs among the major leaders who saved the Union. Robert O'Hara Jr. is a reporter at the Washington Post who has focused on privacy, national security, federal contracting, and the financial world. In 2 decades at the Post, he has won multiple journalism awards. He's been a Pulitzer Prize finalist twice, most recently for a series of explanatory stories about the global financial crisis, and is a recipient of the 2003 Carnegie Mellon Cybersecurity Reporting Award. He's the author of the 2005 book, No Place to Hide, about data profiling, surveillance, and national security, and is an associate of the Center for Investigative Reporting. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Robert O'Hara Jr.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us here today. Several years ago, I went for a Sunday walk with my family at one of our regular destinations, the C&O Canal just north and west of Washington, D.C. Our routine usually took us along a path of crushed stone alongside the water. But on this day, we went another way. We walked on what appeared to be a 2-track road through the woods. I was poking along, giving my son, Cormac, a chance to keep up when I noticed a rusted railing off to the side. It seemed out of place in the forest. When I looked more closely, I saw the rail guarded an open well. There was just enough light below my feet to illuminate words carved into stone. Captain M.C. Meigs and Chief Engineer and Anno Domini 1857. It didn't make sense to me. I had heard of Meigs in my college history courses. I recalled in the vaguest way he was a general in the Civil War. Why would a stone memorial refer to him as a captain? Why in a well, and why there? I lingered over the matter for a moment and tucked it away in my mind for another day. Such questions often come and go for me, but not this time. More than a year later, I began searching for answers. What I have found has delighted me ever since. It turns out the man memorialized on that stone was, as you've already heard, Montgomery Cunningham Meigs. He was a West Point graduate in the early 19th century who became a career Army engineer. He was summoned to Washington in 1852 to find a fresh source of water for a city that had far outgrown the supply provided by springs and wells. That he landed a job in the city was something of a quirk of history. Until then, Meigs had not done anything particularly memorable. It turned out that he was just what Washington needed. Over the next 40 years, Meigs left a greater imprint on the nation's capital than all but a few of the strivers who passed through the city. Meigs, a northerner who happened to be born in the South, embodied the contradictions of his time. Publicly demanding and brash, he was privately tender and loved his family and friends with passion. He was practical and empirical and lived to make things, but he had a powerful imagination and almost could not walk by a portrait or sculpture or stairway without taking stock. From the moment he arrived in the district, he dazzled superiors and lawmakers with his energy, intelligence, and integrity. After identifying the right source of water, the Potomac River at Great Falls, he took on the job of building the city's aqueduct. His system has carried billions of gallons by gravity through miles of culverts lined with millions of bricks. It was on the earth-covered aqueduct that we walked on that Sunday. At the same time, Meigs received orders to oversee the extension of the Capitol building and the installation of its iconic dome, perhaps the greatest construction project of his day. Those projects and the innumerable management challenges they posed helped prepare Meigs for the far more important role he played in the Civil War. They also taught him the hard ways of Washington, where politics has always been played rough. He was constantly under attack by the envious and the corrupt, in part because of one of his defining features. Meigs was an honest man. He also radiated self-assurance and irritability. His friends considered him arrogant, egotistical, and heavy-handed. One gets the impressions that some of his enemies would have been thrilled to punch him in the nose. Once, he was banished to a post on a nearly uninhabited island over his refusal to bow to his boss's corrupt schemes. Meigs craved admiration of his colleagues and countrymen. He wanted his reputation to live on in history, and so he left his name on, or initials on objects installed throughout Washington, cut, etched, or cast copper plates, stone, even on water pipes and machinery. It was one of those markers that caught my eye on that Sunday walk. The defection of colleagues and friends to the Confederacy in 1861 enraged Meigs and fueled his desire to save the country. Quote, "His soul seems on fire with indignation at the treason of those wicked men who have laid the deep plot to overthrow our government and destroy the most noble fabric of freedom the world has ever seen," his wife wrote to her mother as the nation teetered on the brink of dissolution in the spring of 1861. A soul on fire is how I came to think of Meigs. He saw something almost biblical in the nascent struggle and felt that Americans would have to wade through a sea of blood, in his words, before God forgave them for tolerating slavery. Abraham Lincoln opened the way for Meigs, calling on him to serve as Quartermaster General of the Union Army, a managerial and logistical post that Meigs used to become one of the chief architects of the Union victory. He and his Quartermaster Corps marshaled the vast and varied resources of the Northern economy to, in the words of historian James McPherson, make the Union Army the best fed, most lavishly supplied army that ever existed. Meigs served as an advisor in his cabinet and was at the president's side longer than any other military man. That was one of my most interesting discoveries. At Lincoln's behest, Meigs went on the first secret mission of the war in April 1861, and Meigs was in the room when the president succumbed to an assassin's bullet at 7:22 on April 15, 1865. Meigs wasn't always right, but he was always there. A half-century ago, in a footnote in his magisterial account of the Civil War, the writer Alan Nevins said Meigs had been neglected by those interested in the war. That assessment may even be more apt today. Few people know his name, let alone his deeds. Meigs may be the greatest of history's forgotten Americans. Here's a question I've asked throughout my whole project. How can this be? Maybe it's because his landmark engineering successes in the 1850s were overshadowed by the cataclysm of the Civil War. The achievements of his department during the war itself are monumental. But management and logistics have never quite captured the imagination of people quite naturally taken with the heroism and exploits of Robert Lee, Ulysses Grant, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, Sherman, and the other generals in the field. Or was it that Meigs was simply too big a man for a single memorable narrative. Soldier, engineer, architect, inventor, manager, father. It's not always easy to identify with a grumpy genius. Perhaps it's something simpler yet, though. The most coherent narrative of his life comes from his own journals and letters. My speaker's still on. For those who wanted to know him better, there was a problem. His handwriting is nearly illegible. The Library of Congress itself warns researchers to temper their expectations of what may be gleaned from the Meigs documents. Meigs compounded that problem by adopting a self-taught form of shorthand to write in his journals. His script thwarted even the historian Russell Weigley, who wrote a marvelous biography about Meigs almost 6 decades ago. Since then, some 1,500 pages have been transcribed and made public at government expense. To my mind, that alone provided ample reason to revisit the man's life. When Meigs died in 1892, he seemed to have won the recognition that he craved and yearned for. The obituaries could not have been kinder. The Army wrote, "There are few whose character and career can justly be commended or whose lives are more worthy of respect, admiration, and emulation." But then, as surely as the Potomac water pushed through his aqueduct and the sun shone magnificently off the Capitol dome, regular people began to forget the man who so wanted to be remembered. So that's the broad arc of my engagement with Meigs. But in a very real sense, it's only the start of his tale. I believe the details of his thoughts and deeds and actions will occupy historians for many years to come. The National Archives alone, right where we're sitting now, offers storehouses of treasure about this singular character in our American story. Here are a few of those details that continue to captivate me. From the start, Montgomery Meigs was bright, affectionate, and determined. His mother once described him as high-tempered, unyielding, tyrannical, persevering in pursuit of everything he wishes, and that was when he was 6 years old. Meigs attended West Point in 1832 when he was 16. He studied mathematics, engineering, and architecture, including fortifications, along with drawing and painting. He would paint watercolors the rest of his life. He joined the Army Corps of Engineers, an elite organization, and in one of his first assignments, Meigs worked on improving the navigation of the Mississippi River near St. Louis under another West Point graduate, a rising star named Robert E. Lee. Meigs loved the assignment and admired Lee. Quote, "Then in the vigor of youth, one with whom nobody ever wished or ventured to take a liberty, though kind and generous to his subordinates, admired by all women and respected by all men." Meigs worked for years as a journeyman engineer for defense and public works, and he began to think of himself as an American patriot and public servant. And in this, he was fierce. He wrote to his father and he said, "I am a citizen of the United States, not of Connecticut, where my grandfather lived, or of Georgia, where I was born, or of Pennsylvania, where I lived." Meigs received a temporary assignment in Washington at one point, and he found himself attracted to a young woman named Louisa Rogers, the daughter of Commodore John Rogers, naval hero of the War of 1812. After a steady courtship, they married in 1841, and then they anchored their lives to their children, 4 of them born in the first 5 years of their marriage. Meigs was ambitious but unlucky early in his career. He had to watch the war in Mexico from afar, building forts in the north while Army colleagues became famous or received promotions. Ambrose Burnside, Jefferson Davis, Ulysses Grant, Robert Lee, Thomas Jackson, later known as Stonewall. Meigs was deeply envious and almost ashamed that he wasn't in the fight. He dreamed about doing some great thing that might make up for missing the glory of battle in Mexico. And his chance came sooner than expected. after fire ripped through the Library of Congress and nearly spread to the dome. Fire in the district at mid-century in Washington was almost as common as empty political promises. As it happened, the fire could have been easily averted, but there was one big problem. There was no water on hand. The lack of water had other consequences. Those who relied on wells and local ponds often fell prey to typhus and other illnesses. As in many cities at the time, death hovered over the Capitol like a specter. The Capitol fire stirred lawmakers to action, and they agreed to pay for a study for a better source of water, a steady supply. Joseph Totten, the Army's chief engineer, who became a close friend of Meigs, initially chose another man for the job, but that man died unexpectedly. And so a door opened for Meigs that changed his life, and he was summoned to Washington. When he arrived in November of 1852, he was 36 years old, stood almost 6'2", and wore thick side whiskers. He immediately impressed some as arrogant. He was optimistic, though, because his simple orders gave him great latitude to do great things, or so he thought. Meigs was very much a man of his time, the great age of engineering, and to an almost devout degree, he believed in the power of clear thinking. Technical solutions would come to him, he thought, if only he applied scientific principles and demanded excellence of himself. With discipline and enough money, he thought, quote, any achievement of engineering was possible. Now, put yourself in my shoes. You know what Meigs became, and you see this development of the man, and suddenly you realize that everything that's happening to him is preparing him for something greater, and I believe that's the case here. 3 months after arriving, Meigs delivered a brilliant report, spelling out the details of an aqueduct that would deliver water through conduits by gravity from the Potomac near Great Falls. His plan offered a view of the problem that squared with his devotion to improving the world. This guy really wanted to make the world a better place. He was a devout Christian, but he was also a man who just thought it was his obligation to help others. Why not provide so much water, he said, that no one had to worry about waste? With his system, he wrote in his reports, Washingtonians could open fire hydrants and cleanse the streets and gutters, and washing into the sewers the offal of the city, remove at once from sight and smell these offensive and fruitful sources of disease and death. As he waited to hear how his report was received, Meigs hoped almost desperately that he would be recognized for envisioning something special. He wrote to his father, if it is not good and does not give me standing among engineers, I shall be disappointed, for it contains my brains. It was well received. And the man who would become another close friend of Meigs and a mentor, and give him a job of building would give him the job of building the waterworks. That man was the new Secretary of War, Jefferson Davis. Brilliant and sharp-witted, with a straight back and piercing blue eyes, Davis would mean more to Meigs' career than almost any other man. What's more, Davis gave Captain Meigs an even more prominent plum on the same day. Responsibility for enlarging the United States Capitol. It was a fantastic turn for an Army officer with no wartime experience. Meigs eventually helped design the Great Dome that now serves as a symbol of the United States around the world, and it was his engineering insights and inventions and hard work that enabled the dome's installation, 9 million pounds of cast iron. Meigs soon became one of Washington's most prominent men. He had access to the White House, cultivated Congress, and got swept up in one battle after another, mostly over the huge sums of money that he controlled. In case you were wondering, corruption is not a new thing in Washington. Meigs fought constantly against those trying to take cash from the public till. When he was not working, though, one of his favorite activities involved a group called the Saturday Club, and this is another piece of the puzzle that helped him develop as a man and a manager. The club in Washington had no rules, formal leaders, or organizational chart. The only requirement for entrance was some technological or scientific achievement. Members included engineers, explorers, naturalists, and painters. Among them was Joseph Henry, the first secretary of the Smithsonian. Meigs eventually joined some of those men as early members of the National Academy of Sciences. Meigs was a great innovator who adopted technology for new uses. He also loved to tinker and was constantly seeking ways to be more efficient. This was not because he subscribed to Benjamin Franklin's famous adage, time is money. For Meigs, something more important was at stake. It was the work that held out the chance of making something memorable. To speed up his writing, something that took uncounted hours, he adopted a form of shorthand that had recently been invented. It was Pitman shorthand. He used it for his personal journals, as I mentioned earlier. His enthusiasm was a mixed blessing. His normal script was generally illegible and sometimes undecipherable. The shorthand script would prove nearly impossible to read, at least for all but a few specialists, for 150 years. On March 4th, 1857, one of the most hapless men in American history was inaugurated President of the United States, and with him came a man who would make Meigs' life miserable, Secretary of War John B. Floyd. He was a former governor of Virginia, and he's integral to Meigs' story. He came into office with the apparent conviction that it was his right to provide patronage to his friends. He also thought that slavery was a natural right of Southerners that needed defending at all costs. Meigs and his family were deep on principle against slavery. To the degree that he was known around the country, it was for a proposed tax on products of northern states that refused to return fugitive slaves to Virginia. Floyd pressed Meigs constantly to bend the rules and direct contracts to his friend. Meigs resisted at every step. Eventually, Floyd removed Meigs from both the Capitol and Aqueduct projects, and in the fall of 1860 ordered him to Fort Jefferson on an island off the coast of Florida. It had been an extraordinary run. Meigs had taken on more in his 7 years in the Capitol than some engineers could manage in a career. The dome was not finished, but Meigs had put all the pieces in play, and with aplomb and ingenuity solved all the significant engineering problems. He had managed more than $9 million in government spending without a blemish on his honor. As Meigs prepared for his exile, the run for the White House, of course, entered its final stage. Though Meigs could not know it, the election of Abraham Lincoln would open another door and the greatest opportunity of his life. Meigs did a superb, zealous job reinforcing Fort Jefferson, and when he returned to Washington in February following secession and the exit of Floyd from Washington, Francis Preston Blair, the politician and journalist, said, quote, "They sent Meigs to gather a thistle, but thank God he has plucked a laurel." Meigs yearned immediately to be involved in war preparations. He thought Confederate leaders should be hanged, including his former friend Jefferson Davis and his pal Robert Lee. In a letter in that spring is when Louisa wrote her letter saying his soul seems on fire. Meigs soon got his chance. One day, while Meigs was doing his work on the aqueduct, Secretary of State William Seward summoned him to the White House. President Abraham Lincoln had a problem to solve and wanted to talk to a soldier about certain military operations. Now, it was unusual for a president to seek the advice from a captain, but of course, these were unusual times, and Meigs was an unusual man. Lincoln spoke freely. He was determined, it seems, to keep control of Fort Pickens on the Gulf of Mexico in Pensacola, Florida. He told Meigs that General Winfield Scott, the Army's elderly leader, thought that reinforcing the fort was impossible. Lincoln asked Meigs whether Pickens could be held. Certainly, Meigs said, if the Navy would do its duty and had not lost it already. Lincoln knew he had the right man. Now, this is really an interesting passage in American history because nobody has ever done, or at least not until then, quite what Lincoln had done. Without consulting his Secretary of War or Navy, he ordered Meigs to prepare an amphibious assault on Fort Pickens. The next week was filled with precedent, improvisation, and intrigue. There were spies throughout the government at that point, and so they were careful about putting anything in writing. Meigs and a handful of colleagues sorted out the logistics, chartered fast steamships, and secretly gathered nearly 500 men and tons of supply at the Navy Yard in Brooklyn, New York. Before dawn on April 7, 1861, the force was heading south. While on that trip, Meigs wrote that he hoped the mission would, quote, strike terror into the ranks of the rebellion. He also believed that the country would survive, and I'm moved every time I read these words. I see a bright future in which a great land under a strong and united government will at length be free and happy, he wrote at the time, when traitors will have received due punishment for their crimes and the sin of slavery wiped out by the hands of an avenging God. Dang, they wrote differently than we do now, don't they? The trip was a success. Pickens was secure. And then, with a little bit of trepidation on Meigs's behalf, he finally heard the good news. President Lincoln offered him the most important job of his career, Quartermaster General of the Union Army. There might have been no man in the country better prepared than Meigs from all the work he had done in the 1850s to be Quartermaster General. And yet, his training as a soldier, builder, and manager fell far short of the demands he faced that spring and summer. The new Army needed a logistical machine that could feed and clothe and arm and move an unprecedented number of men for an unknown amount of time. To create that system, Meigs had to engage in what one historian has called the art of defining and extending the possible, to provide the 3 big M's of warfare: material, movement, and maintenance. Now, this stuff that he was doing then has received relatively little attention when people think about the war. I'm told by people who know more than I do that this is now starting to take hold among historians and that people are starting to embrace the logistics and the management of war and try to come to understanding of it. In fact, I think there's a historian in this room who's one of those people that provided that guidance to me. His job at that point required some very interesting talents. One, improvisation. Doesn't sound like a manager, but he had to improvise. Bold schemes, and perhaps most of all, something that Meigs had in spades: imagination. Near the end of June 1861, Meigs put on another hat, and this is something that few people understand or realize as well, apparently. I certainly didn't, which is he began participating in the White House War Council, which included the president, his cabinet, Scott, Brigadier General Joseph Mansfield, the commander of forces in Washington at the time. They asked him for his thoughts, and he said it was better to fight the Confederacy here than to go into an unhealthy country. Meigs counseled, let's go at them in Northern Virginia. But as the Army prepared for its moves, Meigs discovered that he had been too optimistic about the timeline. It was a far harder task than even he realized. He had trouble mustering animals to support the offensive. He had trouble getting supplies into Washington because the trains were all jammed. It was pretty chaotic. In one case, Meigs ordered 6,000 horses and mules, but they couldn't even get to Washington. And when he tried to buy more, he found that the Southerners had taken them and they were unavailable. The quartermaster also discovered an acute source of one of the most important things in the Civil War, which is wagons. In any case, he went out to Bull Run for the first fight and joined soldiers in a grove of trees and watched as a group of skirmishers fought. As he stood there, he listened to the sound of hostile shells for the first time in his career. Meigs had to fight another adversary at the same time: contractors. They came from everywhere to that spring and summer, angling to sell an unprepared army everything the soldiers needed. There were contractors for bread, contractors for clothing, contractors for shoes. They provided horses, mules, forage, rail transport. steamers, coal, and construction equipment. They supplied the bullets for killing, surgical equipment to cut off mangled limbs, and ambulance wagons to take the wounded and the corpses away. The men of the fast-growing army needed it all, and they needed it now, and that made the government an easy mark for chiselers. A single cattle broker made $32,000, close to $1 million today, on one order simply by signing a contractor and passing it along to a subcontractor. One product embodied the fraud and corruption accompanying the Army's mobilization: shoddy, a fabric made of cuttings and other waste retrieved from the floor of clothing makers. Combined with glue, pounded and rolled, it had the appearance of sturdy cloth. Its lack of integrity became apparent only in the field under hot sun and exposed to drenching showers. It literally fell off the backs of the soldiers. Among his many reforms, Meigs adopted a system that not only produced fine cloth of the same color so that the soldiers didn't kill each other, of the same side, of course, but he also adopted a novelty that remains with us today, which is small, medium, and large sizes. The challenges he faced and his quartermaster department faced were just awesome. Amid the confusion, corruption, and fear, Meigs and his men had to create a supply system that would satisfy the highest generals, the lowliest of volunteers, along with newspaper columnists and lawmakers ready to pounce on any sign of fraud, waste, and abuse. They encountered an endless flow of obstacles with too few men spread across a rugged continent, always under tactical, strategic, and political deadlines. They had to succeed, his quartermaster department, for the simple reason that the Union would lose the war without them. Much has been written about the tactics and glory of battle, but as Napoleon said, an army marches on its stomach. Before a commander can even hope to attack, destroy, or simply wear down an enemy, he must first be able to deliver 3,000 calories a day to his soldiers. He must keep them warm and healthy. Then he has to be able to move them from point A to point B in a reasonable amount of time. There's no glamour in this, only, as Meigs put it, hard work and cold calculation. And Meigs embraced this as his lot. Without the determined efforts of the quartermaster department, the war machine would go haywire, pulling into 1,000 different directions. Quartermaster employees had to be entrepreneurial, dogged, and diplomatic, and they engaged in a complex dance with clothing makers, weapons manufacturers, railroads, the providers of forage, the food for the animals, and of many others, and they made up the steps as they went along. Within a few years, the quartermaster system would dwarf all other industrial enterprises in the United States, with some 130,000 civilian participants. And in superintending this colossal endeavor, Meigs provided momentum to the nation's economy for years afterwards. I'm going to quote James McPherson, who's so articulate on these issues. He said that in these and many other ways, Meigs and his bureau left a permanent mark on American society. Meigs not only managed logistics, he served as an advisor to Secretary Stanton, Seward, and the president himself, while also counseling and scolding generals in the field. Now, Meigs did not have a portfolio to scold the generals in the field, but he got a very firm backing from Stanton, and if somebody needed to be reamed out, it was Meigs who did it. He was often at odds with General George McClellan, the Army leader, who trained his men well but seemed unwilling to push it into the fight. The costs of the delays drove Meigs to distraction, and he was feeling surly about McClellan early in 1862 when he received an unexpected visitor at his office. It was the president, and he was distressed. Lincoln lowered himself into a chair near the fireplace. It was January 10, 1862, and it was one of the lowest moments of the war for Lincoln, Meigs, and the Union itself. And we luckily have an account from Meigs of this visit. "General, what shall I do? The people are impatient," Lincoln said. "Chase has no money, Secretary of Treasury Chase has no money, and he tells me he can raise no more. The General of the Army, McClellan, has typhoid fever. The bottom is out of the tub. What shall I do?" Well, as you know now, Meigs was a little bit irritable about McClellan, so he counseled change. He said, "Look, if McClellan has typhoid fever, it would take him 6 weeks to recover. Rebel forces could attack any day. Meigs said the president should consider replacing McClellan and get on with the war. He urged Lincoln to gather his generals." As soon as Lincoln mentioned that, it should be noted, McClellan suddenly felt better and joined the meeting. Meigs and his quartermaster department achieved great things, even if the Union Army sometimes did not in those early days. Consider the Peninsula Campaign in 1862. Now, I'm going to throw a bunch of numbers out, but you can't really understand even the heart and soul of Meigs and his effort without understanding some of these numbers. And I'll let you fill in the context. 400 vessels transported more than 100,000 men over several weeks' time. The flotilla formed the core of a huge fleet that the Quartermaster Department would maintain for ocean transport during the war. Meigs eventually leased 753 steamers, 1,100 sailing vessels, and more than 800 barges. The Peninsula Fleet transported more than 14,000 animals, 3,600 wagons, 700 ambulances, and mountains of feed. Feed was one of the biggest issues of the Civil War, which cost the Treasury, and logistically getting it from the Northeast down into the Eastern Theater was just brutally hard. They transported mountains of feed, rations for the men, pontoon bridges, telegraph gear, and vast amounts of other equipment. Quote, "The magnitude of the movement can scarcely be understood except by those who participated in it," one officer wrote later. Meigs desperately, as the war went on, wanted the Army to make the most of what his department had made available. He obsessed over finding efficiencies. In September 1862, he turned his zeal on McClellan about the Army's use of wagons. Now, questions about such a lowly wagon might seem trivial against the spreading carnage. Meigs knew better. Steamboats and railways offered remarkable advantages to the North over the South, but supplies still had to get from wharves and depots to soldiers in the field. The wagon was the way. And Meigs loved the regulation Army model known as the Conestoga. And when it was used properly, he thought it was nearly perfect, but of course it wasn't properly used. Not until Meigs cracked down. At this point in the war, soldiers, some of them were looking for an adventure, brought along clocks. They had standing clocks, they had stoves, they had feather beds, and the wagons were just jammed. They could barely move. They could not move, in fact, in muddy weather. It was crazy. Meigs cracked down, and one of the things that he prohibited were these giant tents called Sibley tents. And they were huge, they were heavy, they used a lot of cotton. So Meigs demanded that the armies begin using something that was much smaller and used far less cotton, which was very, very expensive for the North at the time. And they were called shelter tents officially. But the soldiers dubbed them, these small shelters, dog tents, because of what it seemed fit for, a dog. Sometimes they would stick their head out of the tent and bark. But of course, you've all know probably that these small shelter tents eventually became known as pup tents. Meigs was obsessed about horses, and with good reason. Union forces relied on the animals to a degree that might be hard to imagine now. It needed horses and mules for its very existence. The numbers in play were astounding. Armies with some 426,000 men would soon have 114,000 horses and another 90,000 mules, And that's not counting the creatures sidelined by illness or fatigue. The issue of the forage and feeding these animals and how it all comes into play, I think, hopefully is becoming apparent. It's the moving parts that they had to deal with and the core issues of food for the animals. It's not something we think of. It certainly isn't glamorous, and yet it was fundamental, the delivery of something so basic. The delivery of supplies, not so much forage, but food for the men and bullets and replacement weapons, was fundamental to the Northern Armies prevailing at Gettysburg. And in that case, a key was one of the Army's railroad wizards, a genius named Herman Haupt. There was one small rail line that he identified that could work, and thank God it was there, but it was almost ridiculous. It had no place for the trains to turn around. It didn't even have a watering station along this stretch that they needed to deliver this all the supplies. Haupt came in, and in his genius, he recognized that the Army needed at least 30 trains each way to transport supplies out and then bring the wounded back. And he realized the solution. And as a result of that, the Army was well supplied, and the soldiers never saw the source of supplies. They were there, and suddenly what they needed was available, and they were able to hold on. It was quite a thing. Now, Meigs was proud of that, and he was excited as anyone about the victory. But after the battle, he refused to move on entirely without mopping up the blood-drenched terrain where the bodies lay, horses wandered still, and weapons rested on the churned-up dirt. He was so frugal and so aware constantly of 5 steps out that he knew the Army was going to need the supplies that were there. So he sent his men in, and they collected huge amounts of material, some of it from people who had stolen it from the battlefield. One man took a cannon and hid it in a well. Others tried to obscure the brands on the hides of horses. It was not a proud moment for some of the local residents. They eventually recovered more than 24,000 muskets and rifles, 10,000 bayonets, 2,400 cartridge boxes, sabers, belts, and hundreds of other items that were made available to keep the Army fighting. Meigs, as you can see now, was involved in the math. He was involved in conceptualizing how to solve problems, in getting the right people. He was terrific at delegating things. But he also had that role as a consultant and as advisor. He believed in unrestrained warfare. Very early on, he realized that the Army could not win the war simply by good supply systems, that he wanted them to take everything they could, the Army to take everything it could from the Southerners. He wanted to use their horses, he wanted to steal their land, he wanted to eat their food, everything. And that's why he so admired the toughness of Grant and Sherman when he did an examination of what they did in the Western Theater. In an overview of the situation that Seward had commissioned in the summer of 1863, Meigs applauded their willingness to cut free of communication and supply lines. Such aggression gave the Federals extraordinary flexibility of maneuver while lightening the load on his supply system. And he also praised Grant's reliance on freed slaves as soldiers and laborers. And he admired those soldiers, those freed slaves, and the hard work that they showed themselves capable of doing. Meigs was one of the earliest advocates of turning freed slaves into a weapon against the South. And I thought that was notable as well. In the end of his report, Meigs said something I thought was very interesting, and remember, this is 1863. He warned Seward that the Union faced tough going until the very end of the war, and he said that the rebels, quote, are a gallant people and will make stern resistance, and it is the exhaustion of men and money that finally terminates all modern wars. Late that summer, while on an inspection tour of the armies, Meigs received a telegram ordering him to leave for Chattanooga, Tennessee. A ferocious battle was underway just southeast of the city near a stream called Chickamauga Creek. Stanton wanted Meigs to help bring order to the Army of the Cumberland and send back reports about the action. This was one of Meigs' most memorable and important excursions during the war. When he arrived, the fight was over. Meigs found a perilous situation. Both sides had lost more than a quarter of their forces to casualties, more than 34,000 in all. The battered Union forces rested in strong, well-provisioned camps throughout the town, but their sense of security was short-lived. The Southern men had cut rail lines to the federal supply base in Nashville and occupied nearby Lookout Mountain, which towers 1,500 feet over Chattanooga, along with Missionary Ridge, an impregnable seeming position 500 feet high. Union fighters were surrounded, and all they had was a single mountain path to bring in supplies. The descriptions of what unfolded that fall are pretty extraordinary. The hot dust in Chattanooga, one man recalled, whipped through the Union encampments. It had not rained for 2 months. Any shade disappeared as the men cut down trees for their fortification and fires. The grass withered and turned gray, and food trickled in, at least until the rains began in early October. And then the hunger grew as the river rose and mud sucked at the wheels of supply wagons. Soldiers began to debate whether it had been better broiling in the sun or dying a cool, damp death through starvation. One wagon driver became so troubled by the mud on the single path he had to follow that instead of beating his mules in the usual manner, he sat still in his seat and he wept. The logistical challenges facing Meigs and his corps there were nearly overwhelming. Thousands of mules had died from starvation, and the work of hauling rations in for 50,000 men and forage for the other starving animals. Meigs scrambled in his usual way to bring order and improve the situation. He urged Stanton to send mules, in part to support Hooker's arriving men. He guided pioneer troops who had put 2 abandoned sawmills into action, spitting out lumbers for boats, fortifications, and other uses. He essentially, while the military was planning its follow-through fight, it's how it was going to get out of this fix, Meigs was preparing, did what he did best. He was preparing to help them with supplies and logistics. The key to, or a key to their success was a quartermaster man named Captain Arthur Edward, who had responsibility for building a boat that could go over the shallows of Muscle Shoals and bring in supplies. And over time, they built the boat, and it succeeded. And when they delivered the food, the men were almost ecstatic. They described it as part of a cracker line. Some of you have heard that phrase of deliverance. And here's a quote that I've always been impressed by. Their joy at seeing the little steamboat and scow afloat and loaded with rations can only be faintly imagined and hardly described. They shouted and danced on the banks of the river like crazy men. It's quite that sort of underscores the importance of supplies. Meigs stayed on through the end, and he was able to watch as the Union troops marched, now that they've been fed and they're rested, they marched out of their lines in strict formation. And it was as though they were on parade. More Union fighters followed them. And the South seemed stunned by this, as though it was just some sort of drill. Those on the front lines found themselves overrun on the southern front lines. And as Meigs wrote, it was surprise and open daylight. And he wrote this in a dispatch that went to Stanton, and it was eventually published in the newspapers. And you can see that this desk general is absolutely delighted to be in such an important fight in the war. It's a great dispatch. Later in November, Grant ordered a general advance, and he didn't intend for the men to go far, but as Grant and Meigs and others looked on, they scrambled higher and higher on their own initiative, went far beyond their orders. They went over rifle pits and through a hailstorm of shell, grape, and musket fire. Some fainted, all of them became soaked in sweat, and they feared that if they stopped, they would die. Meigs couldn't believe that what was unfolding before him. No one could. He wrote, "With cheers answering to cheers, the men swarmed upward," and he gave thanks for witnessing what he called the great battle of the rebellion, and eventually called it we described one of the battles as the battle above the clouds. Some of you may have heard that. One of the greatest achievements of the Quartermaster Corps was on May 4th, 1864, when the Army of Potomac began its overland campaign. It would culminate nearly a year later with the fall of Richmond, but only after what Grant described as desperate a fighting as the world has ever witnessed. And again, the numbers associated with the offensive, the supplies, the men, and the death remain astounding. The force included nearly 100,000 infantry, 15,000 cavalry, 6,000 artillerymen. The Quartermaster Department deployed some 4,300 wagons to carry an immense supply of pork, crackers, coffee, salt, sugar, and along with mess kits. Drawing those wagons were 23,000 mules, and more than 30,000 horses carried cavalry soldiers and pulled the artillery. Thanks to one of Meigs's underlings, it all worked like a clock, like a fine watch. Grant later described it as probably the most efficient movement that the world had ever seen by an army. But there was, of course, hellish casualties, and the wounded who made it to the various rivers were transported by steamboat to Washington, and that created another problem. In less than a month, the city's hospitals took in 18,000 new patients. Some of them died in short order, and then the corpses stacked up faster than they could be buried, and a stench drifted over this city like smoke. And Meigs had to provide an answer to the grim but very practical question, where would all the bodies go? It just so happened that he knew exactly where he wanted to bury the bodies. One journalist, Noah Brooks, who was a friend of Lincoln's, called these waves of sorrow. But of course, it was Arlington, the estate of Robert Lee's family. A beautiful spread of land and hills on the south side of the Potomac. You all are familiar with it. On June 15th, Meigs toured the property, asked for permission, sketched out how he wanted it to be, and put those orders into effect. Now, locating the cemetery at Arlington was at root a logical decision. The land was close to Washington's hospitals, and it was relatively easy to access. But there's little doubt that Meigs's bitterness about Robert Lee's defection factored into the choice. As he wrote several months later, he wanted Lee and other Confederate leaders tried and executed by the government which they have betrayed and attacked. Some people have made the assumption that Meigs was driven by the death of his son, John, who was killed in a fight out in the Shenandoahs. But John wasn't killed until later in the year. In any case, at Arlington, Meigs was intent on ensuring that the Lee family never had an opportunity to move back to the plantation. And I think it's revealing of his character as well as his, it kind of scares me looking at that photo. I mean, I don't want him grading my paper or anything like that. But by now, it's very interesting. He was able to function. He was able to manage. He did one brilliant thing after the next, and yet he was very pissed off, bitter man, and sort of very righteous in core. And to make sure that the Lee family did not move back into the house and onto the plantation, he made sure that 26 graves were planted or were dug around the favorite garden. and as if to Mary Lee's Rose Garden. And as if to underscore the point, Meigs dug a mass grave nearby to hold a huge pit to hold the bones of unidentified soldiers. Now, Meigs took pride, great pride in Arlington, and hoped that Americans would understand his role in its creation. And by now, you probably won't be surprised to hear that on the McClellan Gate, Meigs put his name in gold leaf. I don't know why I think that's funny, but so later that year, while the siege is taking place in Richmond, Lee secretly dispatched Jubal Early to clear out the lightly defended Shenandoah Valley, but he also said you can freelance if you want, and that included attacking Washington. And in some ways, as committed as Meigs was to the administrative work, the guy was depressed after Chattanooga. He was going crazy, going back to his desk, and he really wanted to be out in the field. He wanted to have a field command. He still had this lingering doubts about missing the war in Mexico. And so when Early actually began headed towards Washington, it was clear there was going to be an attack. Meigs finagled a chance to lead a division that he built from clerks and invalids. And he was so happy, and he formed them. They gave them weapons. They had done some training the year before, but he argued that at minimum they could show force and make Early delay, because Early wouldn't be sure if they were real fighters or not. And so Meigs writes about going up and sleeping in an orchard, and he writes, and it's kind of funny, in this grandiose style, and how proud he is of his men, and he just felt it was really cool sleeping in a poncho. And not to make fun, but you could see he's very excited about all this. And lo and behold, when Early came into the city, came down from the north, it was Fort Stevens in Washington that was right in the line of his attack. And so Meigs was there with his men, and had the chance to lead men in the field, and he was very proud of that. But perhaps the most extraordinary thing about the scene was the presence of the United States of America, who could not himself resist the chance to see the fighting firsthand. And for the second day in a row, Lincoln had gone up there in carriage, and he stood on the parapet looking down at the fighting. If you haven't been to Fort Stevens, it's a really cool experience because you can almost imagine what it was like. In any case, the president is right there. There's bullets that are thudding into the berm. It's an earth fort. And one of them hit a surgeon standing a few feet away. A chorus of men urged him to take cover. And one of them said, "Get down, you damn fool." And that was Captain Oliver Wendell Holmes. According to legend, now Holmes later acknowledged in a letter, "Yes, I was there. We don't know if those words were spoken, but it's too good not to include in the story." The president lowered himself after being admonished, bobbed up periodically, and he was in harm's way every time. But when the rebel force withdrew, the president cheered along with everybody else. And for Meigs, it was a certain kind of high point in his career, because not only was he able to lead men under fire, during the fighting, a War Department courier handed him a letter from Stanton. And Stanton and Meigs had become very close. Stanton made Meigs look like a kitten in terms of his gruffness and so on. But the two had become very intimate, and they relied on one another. It turns out that Meigs had been brevetted Major General for, quote, "distinguished and meritorious services to the present war." So Meigs was very pleased about the outcome. The Quartermaster Department, including the Railroad Construction Corps, also played a major role in Sherman's march on Atlanta. Meigs in Chattanooga before had ordered a mill to be created to fix railroad lines, and now it was put into effect, and timing. And the railroad workers repaired the lines so fast that they were almost, just barely in front of the Army. As a result of the work and the collaboration between the Quartermaster and Sherman, Meigs respected Sherman, who in turn had great confidence in the Quartermaster. It was said that upon receiving one dispatch from Meigs, scratched out in his own wretched script, Sherman endorsed it with these words: "The handwriting of this report is that of General Meigs, and I therefore approve it, but I cannot read it." Now, I think I'm going to stop there with the idea that surely you can guess that the supply at the end of Sherman's March to the Sea was spectacular, almost miraculous. The detail of clothing, boots, thread and needle, everything was there that they needed. Meigs kept them supplied during the march through South Carolina and north. As I've already told you, Meigs, when he went back to Washington, was with the president when he died. He presented the president in the Capitol building, and had one great logistical challenge after the war, which was sending the men home. And I'll leave you with, I'll end with this thought, because I just think it's so interesting, that Meigs sensed grandeur in the sending all these men home like that. The logistics were akin to those needed for the massive offensive of the previous year, save for the absence of gunfire and the strange finality of it all. Meigs wrote that the government sent the men back to every hamlet and village of the states north of the Potomac and Ohio rivers, and restored to their homes, the labor of the war over, to return to the pursuits of peaceful industry which they had left at the call of their country in the hour of her need. So I'm open to any questions. And if you have questions, please go to the microphones.
We have time for about 2 questions. You could go to the microphone.
Where do we find the well?
The well is, if you go to Angler's Inn, and if you've ever been there, you'll see there's some steps that go, there's some Don Johns, and there's steps that go up. And I've always wondered, what were those steps for? Take the steps, and then you'll be on a 2-track lane. And if you just walk, you'll come right to that rail and look down, and you'll see the memorial. Yes?
Robert, that was great. Could you mention the relationship that Meigs had with his brother-in-law, who would become Admiral John Rogers, and the building of the boats on the Mississippi River? I think that's a fascinating story.
One of the great Meigsians in Washington who helped. Since we don't have a lot of time, I'll say that one of the first things that Meigs began doing in his first day in office was to create armored boats for what they call the Brown Water Navy, to fight the fight in the West. And those boats were responsible for the first victories and helped sustain the morale of the country. And they served to carve a path into the South that was fundamental. And Meigs helped design and build them with his brother-in-law, John Rogers, who was great in his own way. And yes?
Hi, I'm John Elliff with the Lincoln Group of D.C., but the question doesn't involve Lincoln, but contraband camps. Did he do anything with the contraband camps?
Well, there were contraband camps at Arlington, and they helped set up They helped set up schools and so on, but that's not a deep part of my research, so I can't go into much detail. But he did, I will say this, Meigs was somewhat ambivalent in the way that he expressed his opposition to slavery during the 1850s. It's hard not to believe that he didn't want to offend Jefferson Davis. He also was afraid of disruption, and so he was not a fervent anti-slavery person. After the war began, it's almost like the scales fell off his eyes, and he understood there was no reconciling our democracy and slavery, and he became a tremendous fan of free slaves when he saw the work they were able to do and the energy that they threw into the work that they did.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you have more questions for Robert, he will be upstairs outside of the archive store, and you'll also be signing copies of his book.
Let the record show I didn't mean to talk as long as I did.